Catherine Brennan stood at the altar, prepared to marry a kind man she did not love. And then she lifted her eyes to the groom, and her heart stopped. It was not Oliver Ashfield waiting for her beneath the white flowers and candlelight. It was his brother, Adrien Ashfield, Duke of Ravenfield, the man who had never touched her improperly, the man who had looked at her as though restraint itself was becoming a wound, the man she had spent months trying not to love because loving him had seemed the surest path to ruin. For one suspended, impossible second, all Catherine could hear was the blood crashing in her ears and the faint, collective breath of the church as every guest began to realize something was wrong. Or perhaps not wrong, perhaps only true. Adrien's face gave almost nothing away to the room. He stood in perfect ducal stillness, broad-shouldered and severe in black formal dress, with the hard, disciplined beauty of a man who had been denying himself for so long that denial had become visible in the lines of his body. Only his eyes betrayed him. They were fixed on Catherine with such naked intensity that her fingers tightened around her bouquet until the stems bent. At his side stood Oliver, not wounded, not furious, not humiliated, but steady and smiling, very slightly, like a man who had finally done one decent thing at the exact cost decency required. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to the channel, follow me to the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this love story travels. 1 year earlier, Catherine Brennan had first met Adrien Ashfield at a midsummer musicale in Bath. She had gone because her aunt insisted, because respectable girls without fortunes were always being carried like polished offerings into rooms where eligible men might glance in their direction, and because saying no too often created its own reputation. She expected boredom. She expected old women appraising hems and dowries. She expected men who smiled first at beauty and only afterward at good sense. She did not expect the Duke of Ravenfield to be standing near the open terrace doors with his younger brother, both dark-haired, both handsome, both unmistakably Ashfields, and yet entirely different in the force they carried. Oliver was warmth at once, easy, bright, quick to laugh, a man who moved through a room as though he assumed the world might be kind, and often found that it was. Adrien was the opposite. Not cold, never cold, but contained. He carried his title the way some men carried scars, not theatrically, not proudly, but with the quiet knowledge that it had shaped every decision of his life. He was a duke with vast responsibilities, an ailing mother, an estate strained by old obligations, and a family name that could not survive even one spectacular mistake. Which meant, Catherine would later understand, that by the time he looked at her for the first time, he was already a man predisposed to deny himself anything dangerous. She noticed him because he was difficult not to notice. He noticed her because she laughed at something Oliver said and then, catching herself, covered the laugh with the back of her fingers as though pleasure were something she ought to apologize for. That small, unconscious gesture struck him with absurd force. Neither of them knew that yet. Oliver was introduced first. Within moments, he had drawn Catherine into easy conversation about books, provincial assemblies, and why half the music performed in fashionable rooms deserved to be quietly drowned in the nearest decorative fountain. Catherine liked him at once. Everyone did. Adrien joined them a few minutes later, and where Oliver's attention felt like sunlight, Adrien's felt like the charged stillness before a storm. He asked her whether she actually liked the soprano currently murdering Handel. Catherine, surprised into honesty, said, "Not unless Lord Handel offended her personally." Oliver laughed aloud. Adrien did not, but one corner of his mouth moved, And Catherine discovered in that instant that earning even the smallest sign of amusement from him felt disproportionately rewarding. That should have warned her. Over the weeks that followed, Oliver called at her aunt's townhouse more often than anyone found surprising. At first, he came alone, then sometimes with Adrien, then, more dangerously, on occasions when circumstances gathered all three of them into the same orbit often enough for habit to form. It was obvious to everyone that Oliver admired Catherine. It was obvious to no one that Adrien was becoming quietly wrecked by her. The trouble began with little things. The Duke, remembering that she preferred the window seat because crowded drawing rooms made her feel as though the walls were inching inward. The Duke sending over a volume of poetry Oliver had mentioned she wanted, though the note attached was signed in both brothers' names. The Duke standing too near one rainy afternoon while taking tea, so near Catherine could feel the clean chill of outdoors still clinging to his coat, and had to keep both hands clasped in her lap to stop herself from doing something mad, like reaching toward him. None of it was enough to name. All of it was enough to fear. Catherine had not been raised foolishly. She knew the difference between warmth and danger. Oliver's regard was open, flattering, safe. Adrien's was the kind one could only survive by pretending not to feel it. So she pretended. The problem was that Adrien did too. He told himself, with increasing severity, that his interest in Catherine was a passing weakness, sharpened by proximity, and by the fact that she looked at him neither greedily nor fearfully, nor with the practiced flirtation society women used when they wanted something from a duke. She looked at him as though he were a man first and a title afterward. It had been years since anyone had done that, and because he knew exactly how dangerous he found that fact, he tried to limit his own exposure to her. He failed almost immediately. There was a picnic at Ashfield Court late in September, held under a pale gold sky with half the county invited. Catherine spent much of the afternoon with Oliver, who was attentive without ever pressing, kind without being cloying, and increasingly spoken of by surrounding mothers as though the match were already halfway arranged. Adrien told himself it was a relief. It should have been. Oliver was his brother. Oliver was good. Oliver would be gentle with her. Oliver wanted nothing from Catherine but the right to make her happy. Adrien ought to have been grateful. Instead, he spent the better part of the afternoon discovering that jealousy, when stripped of pettiness and forced through the conscience of an honorable man, became something far uglier. It became guilt. It became hunger with no moral exit. It became the sight of Catherine smiling up at Oliver by the orchard wall and knowing, with a sickness that lodged under his ribs, that if his brother asked for her hand that very night, Adrien would have no right to object and no chance of ever recovering from it. Catherine, meanwhile, was having her own revelation.
Oliver was beside her. Adrien was 20 yards away speaking to a magistrate, and yet she knew with humiliating certainty which man had altered the very texture of the afternoon merely by being present in it.
When Oliver handed her a slice of pear tart, she thanked him warmly. When Adrien glanced across the lawn at her just once, she forgot how to breathe. That night she lay awake in her aunt's house and understood, with the cold precision of disaster, that she was already in love with the wrong brother. She resolved to master it. For almost a month she succeeded, at least outwardly. Then came Ravenfield House. The Dowager Duchess suffered a chill that turned ugly, and because Catherine's aunt had once been a close companion to her Grace, a discreet invitation arrived asking whether Catherine might assist for a few days with correspondence, reading, and the management of the calmer domestic routines Lady Ashfield could no longer comfortably oversee. It was the sort of invitation that looked innocent on paper. It was anything but innocent in practice. For 10 days, Catherine lived under the same roof as both brothers. 10 days in which Oliver's affection deepened into unmistakable courtship. 10 days in which Adrien became a masterwork of self-denial. 10 days in which Catherine discovered that a house could be full of people and still feel most dangerous in doorways, libraries, stair landings, and the half-second after one person says goodnight and no one moves. It was there she learned the first real secret of the Ashfield brothers. Not from gossip, from an accident. She entered the blue morning room one evening to fetch a misplaced shawl and found the Dowager Duchess in tears, while Adrien stood by the fire, one hand braced on the mantel, listening in a silence so taut it seemed to ring. "You cannot keep paying for your father's mistakes forever," the Dowager said. "Nor Oliver's innocence." Catherine froze beyond the partly open door. Adrien's reply came low and controlled. "I can if I must. You sold the North Meadow leases. I rearranged them. You mortgaged your own London holdings to settle your father's election debts before Oliver ever knew they existed." A long pause. "Mother, you have spent 10 years being brother, father, guardian, and duke all at once. At what point does any of it belong to you?" Adrien did not answer. Catherine backed away before she could hear more, but the damage was done. For the first time, she understood that the severe restraint in him was not mere temperament. It had been built, brick by brick, debt by debt, sacrifice by sacrifice. And because Oliver still moved through the world with such openness, Catherine also understood something else. Adrien had built that ease around his brother like a wall, and Oliver, bless him, had mistaken the wall for weather. That knowledge altered everything. It made Adrien's distance sadder. It made Oliver's goodness more complicated. It made Catherine's own heart far less willing to obey reason. 2 nights later came the masquerade. The Duchess, recovering enough to crave spectacle, insisted on holding a small autumn masquerade rather than cancel the season's most anticipated house gathering. Masks, music, candlelight, and the usual aristocratic foolishness made honesty nearly impossible, and temptation nearly theatrical. Catherine wore silver-gray silk and a half-mask of seed pearls. Oliver danced with her first. Adrien did not dance with her at all, which should have protected everyone. Instead, it became its own kind of torment. Across the ballroom, over shoulders and candles and circling bodies, Catherine kept feeling Adrien's gaze find her and leave her and find her again. Once, only once during a country dance, the lines shifted so that she passed close enough to him to hear him murmur, "You should not have worn this color." Catherine's pulse tripped. "Why?" "Because," he said without looking at her, "it is becoming difficult to remember I am not a selfish man." Then he moved away before she could answer. That might have been the whole of it. But later that night, Catherine stepped into the West Gallery for air and overheard something she was never meant to hear.
At first, it was only 2 gentlemen speaking in low tones behind the velvet curtains. One was the son of a viscount. The other was one of Oliver's supposed friends.
"Ravenfield will force the younger brother to make the Brennan match," one said.
He needs a respectable, inexpensive alliance to quiet the whispers about the Dowager's debts.
That was before the widow Harbury's daughter became available.
And what happens to Brennan?
A shrug in the voice. "She'll do for Oliver. The Duke never wanted her for himself. That much is obvious." Catherine went cold from scalp to heel. There it was, the fear she had not let herself name, that perhaps Adrien's distance was not sacrifice at all. Perhaps it was indifference. Perhaps she had built a cathedral of feeling on a foundation of nothing. Perhaps Oliver's courtship had always merely been the useful arrangement, and she, fool that she was, had mistaken a few charged silences for mutual ruin. That would already have been enough. But then the curtains shifted, and through the narrow break in the velvet, she saw Adrien himself standing at the far end of the gallery with Lady Harbury and her daughter. Lady Harbury was smiling, the way ambitious women smiled when they believed a negotiation was nearly complete. "Ravenfield House requires steadiness now, Your Grace," she was saying. "Not sentiment. My daughter understands position. She would never ask to come before the estate." Adrien's profile was turned partly away from Catherine. Candlelight caught the hard line of his cheek and the weariness beneath it. He answered too quietly for Catherine to hear every word. She caught only fragments. "What is required? The family must come first. Oliver's future must be secured." Then Lady Harbury, satisfied, placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. "And the Brennan girl?" she asked with easy disdain. "Surely that little complication has sorted itself if Oliver is willing." Adrien did not immediately remove her hand. He did not immediately deny it. And in the one lethal second that followed, Catherine saw him lower his head once as if in exhausted concession. It was not a lover's gesture. It was not even consent. But from the shadows, with her heart already primed to bleed, it looked like surrender, like calculation, like a man choosing his family, his duty, his estate, and quietly passing her to his brother as one more matter to be arranged. Catherine stepped back as though the floor itself had shifted under her. Now the humiliation was complete. Not just that society might think her useful, not just that idle men might speak of her as though she were movable property, but that Adrien, whose silences she had turned into a secret language, whose restraint she had mistaken for reverence, might in fact be capable of hearing her reduced to a practical solution and answering with silence. She left the gallery before anyone could see her. The next morning she was so composed that even her aunt remarked upon it approvingly. Inside, Catherine felt flayed alive. Adrien, who had grown dangerous in his ability to read the smallest shifts in her face, noticed at once. Whatever he saw there troubled him. But whenever he attempted to come near her over the next 2 days, Catherine gave him nothing. Not coldness dramatic enough to invite inquiry, something worse, perfect, finished politeness. She spoke to Oliver with care. She spoke to Adrien as one might speak to a magistrate handling a land dispute. And because she refused him even the mercy of visible injury, Adrien could not easily demand an explanation without exposing too much of himself. That uncertainty began to work on him like poison. It should have been enough to keep them safely apart. Instead came the old mill. It happened because Oliver, with all the innocent confidence of a man who still believed the world largely arranged itself toward goodness, suggested a riding party to view the renovated mill cottages on Ashfield land. Rain scattered the larger group before noon. Horses had to be led back by grooms. One carriage broke an axle. In the confusion, Catherine was separated from the others with Adrien and a single footman who went off in search of assistance. For 15 minutes they stood beneath the overhang of the abandoned mill while rain hammered the river and the old wheel groaned in the swollen current. 15 minutes, long enough to ruin both of them. Water silvered the air beyond the low stone arch. Catherine's gloves were damp. Adrien had removed one of his own and was wrapping it slowly around the head of his riding crop, a useless gesture of control by a man in desperate need of one. Neither of them spoke at first. Then Adrien said, with a restraint so severe it bordered on anger, "I have apparently offended you in some way I am not permitted to understand." Catherine turned to him. The bluntness of it almost made her laugh. "Permitted," she said. "How strange that you should use that word." His head lifted. "I have tried to speak to you for 2 days. And I have tried for far longer than that," she said, "to understand what exactly I am to this family." The riding crop stopped moving in his hand.
What does that mean?
It means, Catherine said, and now the rain was a mercy because it let her keep her voice low without fearing she would be overheard, that I am tired of being looked at one way and managed another. I am tired of being made to feel things no honorable woman should feel, only to discover I may have imagined all of it, while practical arrangements were made over my head. Adrien stared at her. Then color left his face. Who has spoken to you? Not who.
What?
When he said nothing, Catherine went on, each word cleaner and more cutting because she had spent 2 nights bleeding them inward first. I heard enough in the West Gallery to understand I might suit Oliver very well if your estate required an inexpensive virtue. And then, in case that humiliation was incomplete, I saw Lady Harbury speak of me as though I were a complication to be tidied away, while you discussed what was required and whose future must be secured. Adrien went utterly still. Catherine could not stop now. I heard her ask about me. I saw her touch your sleeve. I saw you stand there and say nothing that any woman in my position could call a denial. The old mill seemed to narrow around them. Rain pounded the river. The wheel groaned once like something ancient protesting its own turning. When Adrien finally spoke, his voice was low and stunned. You think I offered you to my brother? Catherine's throat tightened. What else was I meant to think? For the first time since she had known him, Adrien Ashfield looked not controlled, but shaken. Lady Harbury was pressing her daughter on me, he said. I was trying to end the conversation without creating a public scene beside half the county. The words you heard were about debts, settlements, leases, and the expectation that I must marry where it most benefits Ravenfield. And Oliver? A hard laugh escaped him. Oliver's future has been tied to mine since the day our father died and left me to clean the wreckage. He took one step toward her then, and the force of contained feeling in him was suddenly terrible. I lowered my head because if I had answered Lady Harbury honestly, I would have said that the only woman I wanted in this county was standing somewhere under my mother's roof wearing silver-gray silk and making it increasingly difficult for me to remember how to behave like a man of sense. Catherine stopped breathing. Adrien's hand tightened around the crop until the leather creaked. I have avoided you, he said, because every time I am near you, I want something I have no honorable right to want. And because my brother admires you. And because for one selfish hour I thought perhaps distance might make me decent again. Instead, it has only made me a coward. Catherine looked at him through the charged dimness of rain and river spray. Then, softly, but without mercy, she said, That is not yet the same as telling me what I am to you. Something in him gave way. Not wildly, not dramatically, but with the exhausted inevitability of a man whose last defense has finally been taken from him. You, he said. Only that. Only one word. It struck her with more force than any declaration could have. He came one step nearer. You, he said again, rougher now. You are the reason I have spent weeks behaving like a man at war with his own blood. You are the reason every honorable intention I form turns false the moment you enter a room. You are the reason I stood in that gallery and let a woman I could not bear speak nonsense at me because the truth, that I wanted you myself, would have disgraced my brother, my mother, and perhaps you most of all. Catherine felt the hurt in her begin at last to change shape. Not gone, but answered.
I needed to hear you say it, she whispered.
His jaw tightened. You should not have had to. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Catherine took one step toward him. Adrien's entire body went taut. Catherine, it was a warning. It was a prayer. It was the most intimate sound she had ever heard. "I know," she said, and because she had spent too many weeks swallowing the truth until it burned, she added, "I know because I want you to. But if you had stayed silent much longer, I think I might truly have learned how to hate you." Pain crossed his face at that. Real pain, sharp enough that she regretted the words even while knowing they were deserved. "If I kiss you now," he said, "I will not be able to pretend afterward that I can still do right by either of us." The clean, historical cruelty of that restraint nearly brought tears to her eyes. So, of course, he kissed her anyway. Not because he lost control in the crude, convenient way weaker men lost it, but because Catherine touched 2 fingers to his wrist, just there, against the pulse beating violently beneath his skin, and the last barrier in him gave way. The kiss was not wild. Wildness would have been easier. It was worse. Controlled, reverent, hungry, and so charged with denied feeling, hurt, relief, and confession that by the time he lifted his head, Catherine could barely stand. Adrien looked as though he hated himself. Catherine had never loved him more. Then, voices were heard in the distance. The footman was returning, and the world, indifferent as always, resumed. But nothing between them was gentle now. It had become true, and therefore dangerous. That kiss did not begin an affair. It began misery. Because both of them now knew too much. Adrien withdrew further. Oliver, seeing only enough to be puzzled by the altered air between them, became gentler and more constant. Catherine, trapped between gratitude and longing, began to understand what it meant to break in clean places where no one could see the damage. Then came the miniature. It was found by accident in the Dowager's writing room, a painted likeness tucked into the wrong devotional volume when Catherine had been asked to fetch a letter case. The miniature was of a young woman Catherine did not know. Beautiful, dark-eyed, intimate in the way the artist had studied her mouth. On the back, in a man's hand, were the words, "For A, who taught me that duty is only love wearing armor. A. Adrien." Catherine replaced the miniature exactly where she had found it, but not before the discovery had done its work. So there had been someone. Someone before her. Someone perhaps lost, perhaps abandoned, perhaps sacrificed to duty just as she herself now would be. The possibility altered her understanding of him yet again. It made his restraint seem older, more practiced, more tragic. It also made her ache with a jealousy so unreasonable she despised herself for it. Then Oliver proposed. He did it in the rose garden behind her aunt's house on a dry autumn afternoon with all the grace, sincerity, and kindness that had always belonged to him. He told Catherine plainly that he admired her judgment, her steadiness, her good heart. He said he did not offer her thunder, only loyalty, not spectacle, but a safe life. He believed they could make each other content. Content. It was the most dangerous word anyone could have given her then, because Catherine knew perfectly well that contentment was often the highest prize women like her were expected to ask for. Not passion, not consuming recognition, not the devastating joy of being wanted by the one person whose wanting might actually remake the world. Only safety, only suitability, only a future no one could criticize. So Catherine, already exhausted by impossible longing and by the daily humiliation of loving a man she could neither claim nor forget, asked for one night to think. That night, Adrien came to the library because Oliver had told him of the proposal, smiling, hopeful, trusting him. Adrien would remember that smile with shame for the rest of his life. He found Catherine standing by the long windows with one hand braced against the frame. Moonlight silvered the carpet. The house was silent. "Has he asked you?" he said.
Yes.
"And will you accept?" It was a brutal question.
Not because he had no right to ask it, because he had every reason to already know the answer she ought to give.
Catherine turned to face him.
Should I?
Adrien looked as though she had struck him.
Yes, he said after a terrible pause, if you are wise.
"Are you asking me to be wise?"
I am asking you, he said, and his voice was so tight it sounded carved from pain. Not to choose a life that destroys us all. Us. He had not meant to say it. They both heard that at once. Catherine's eyes stung.
"And what if I am already destroyed by the life you are asking me to choose?" Adrien actually took one step toward her then, and for one electric second, she thought he might say it all at last, might confess, might beg, might do something selfish enough to save them both. Instead, he stopped. Duty won. It always won with him first. "If there were any honorable path to you," he said, "I would have found it." His eyes searched hers then with the fatigue of a man who had been carrying too many lives for too many years.
And that is precisely the problem,
Catherine said softly. "You think every path must be built by your suffering before you may walk it." Something like pain flashed through him. "Do not make me smaller by forgiving me accurately tonight." Then he bowed his head as though before a sentence already passed. "But there is Oliver." He left her there. The next morning, Catherine accepted Oliver. She did it not because her heart had changed, but because Adrien had made her believe that loving him and choosing him were two entirely different acts, and only one of them could still be called honorable. Oliver's relief was immediate, unguarded, almost boyish in its sincerity. Adrien's reaction was quieter. He received the news standing beside the library fire at Ravenfield House. He inclined his head once, said that Oliver could not have chosen a better woman, and then, later that night, rode alone for 2 hours through sleet so bitter that his groom found blood in one glove where he had clenched the reins against a split knuckle and never noticed. That was how he chose family over love. Not in one grand sentence, not in one noble gesture. He chose it repeatedly. He chose it in ledgers, in silences, in the hard private discipline of a man who believed that if his own desire ruined the structure he had spent 10 years holding upright, then desire itself became a form of selfishness he had no right to indulge. For days after Catherine accepted Oliver, Adrien told himself the decision was now mercifully beyond him. But the lie did not survive contact with reality. Oliver came to him glowing with gratitude, speaking of dates, settlements, guest lists, and how astonishingly fortunate he felt. Their mother, Dorothea, revived all at once into practical energy and spoke of the match as though Providence had finally remembered its obligations to the Ashfield name. Her friends approved. The county approved. Creditors, though never named as such in drawing rooms, relaxed their pressure when rumor began to harden into fact. A prudent bride for Oliver, a politically useful marriage for Adrien still available elsewhere, and all the little whispers around Ravenfield House might finally be quieted, which meant Adrien's torment acquired its final, unbearable shape. If he spoke now, he would not merely wound his brother, he would humiliate him. If he reached for Catherine, he would not merely satisfy his own heart, he would collapse an entire arrangement from which every person he loved, except himself, appeared to benefit. So he made a creed of renunciation. He reviewed tenancy disputes until after midnight. He reopened old accounts no sane steward would have touched in winter. He traveled to London twice on matters that could easily have been handled by letter. He accepted 3 dinners he despised, and the company of 2 eligible women he barely saw. He stood through his mother's gentle but relentless suggestions about alliances, dowries, estates, and appearances, with the fixed face of a condemned man learning to thank the court for efficiency. And all the while, Catherine moved closer to being another man's wife. That was the true beginning of his violence toward himself. After the old mill, he did not kiss her again. He barely allowed himself to look at her when others might notice. But the effort of restraint ceased to feel virtuous and began to feel obscene, because now he knew with certainty that she loved him, and she knew with certainty that he loved her. And still, he intended to place her hand in Oliver's. More than once he nearly broke. Once in the chapel gallery at Ravenfield, when he found Catherine alone after evening prayers, head bent, fingers clasped too tightly around her gloves. He stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, with every instinct in him screaming to cross the room, to ask whether she had slept, whether she hated him, whether she would forgive him if he were less honorable and more brave. Instead, he said only, "My brother worries when you skip dinner." Catherine looked at him with a hurt so dignified it almost stopped his heart. "How fortunate," she said, "that one of you still permits himself the luxury of honesty through concern." He left before she could see that the hand at his side was shaking. Another time he found, among estate correspondence, a note from the jeweler regarding Oliver's ring. Adrien stared at the measurements of Catherine's hand for such a long time that the candle burned down onto the desk. He should have passed the matter on at once. Instead, he folded the paper and put it in his pocket, walked with it there for half a day, then returned it with the rest of the packet as though he had not been carrying physical proof of his own ruin against his heart. The miniature Catherine later found in the dowager's writing room deepened her understanding of him, but its true history belonged to the same pattern. The woman in the portrait had been a cousin of a family allied to Ravenfield years earlier. Adrien had admired her. She had admired him. Nothing dishonorable had passed between them. Then his father's debts sharpened. Oliver needed protecting from a scandal of his own, and Adrien stepped back before anything could become a claim. She married elsewhere. The inscription had been hers. He had kept it not out of ongoing devotion, but because it had become evidence that duty, once invited into love, rarely left without taking love's body with it. That was why Catherine's existence undid him in a new way. She was not the first woman he had denied himself for the sake of order. She was the first denial that felt indistinguishable from moral failure. Meanwhile, Oliver, still unsuspecting at first, tried with all his natural kindness to be the sort of man a woman could safely choose. He brought Catherine books. He listened when she spoke. He noticed when she was tired, and when her smile came a second too late. He blamed himself for her distance, thinking perhaps he had pressed too soon, or asked for too solemn a future from a woman who had had too little time to dream over it. Catherine did her best. That was the tragedy. She was not careless with Oliver's goodness. She answered him gently, accepted his courtesies, stood beside him at dinners, walked with him when propriety demanded, and tried to shape her face into something he would not dread coming home to. But she could not counterfeit the involuntary life that rose in her whenever Adrien entered a room. And Oliver, precisely because he was kind, eventually began to notice the difference between gratitude and joy. The true fracture came in stages. First, he saw Adrien leave a room too quickly whenever Catherine laughed. Then he saw Catherine go pale at the sound of his brother's voice and recover herself only by force. Then he saw, during a Christmas musicale at Ravenfield, Adrien refused to take the chair beside the pianoforte because Catherine was standing there, and stand instead at the far wall like a man preserving distance from a flame no one else in the room could feel. Still, Oliver resisted the truth. He loved them both too well to want to understand what lay before him. The final peace came to him in winter. He found Adrien alone in the old gun room at Ravenfield, standing before their late father's portrait with a glass untouched in his hand. On the desk lay a packet of estate papers, and, beside them, the burned corner of a letter Oliver immediately recognized as Catherine's hand. Adrien did not try to hide it in time. For the first time in years, the brothers spoke not as duke and dependent heir, not as guardian and protected younger son, but as two men standing inside a wound that had finally become too large to ignore. Oliver asked him the question directly. "Do you love her?" Adrien answered with the silence of a man too honest to lie and too late to repair anything with half-truths. Oliver's face changed, not into outrage, into grief. He asked the second question more quietly. "How long?" Adrien told him the truth. This time, not merely the outline of it, but the marrow. About the old mill. About the fact that Catherine had loved him before her engagement and despite it. About how many times he had resolved to remove himself and failed. About their father's debts and the mortgaged London holdings. About their mother's terror of social collapse. About the quiet consensus among older family friends that Oliver must be protected into a respectable marriage, while Adrien was expected to marry strategically, profitably, usefully. About the humiliating revelation that he had begun to use duty not only as a genuine burden, but also as a shield behind which he could hide his own terror of becoming the sort of man who takes happiness from his younger brother. Oliver listened to all of it, and when Adrien finished, he sat down very suddenly, as though his legs no longer trusted the world. It was there, in that room, that the true history between the brothers emerged in full. Their father had been charming, reckless, and ruinously partial. Oliver, the younger, had always been loved more openly. Adrien, the heir, had always been used more heavily. After their father's death, Adrien, barely 23, had paid debts Oliver never knew existed, shielded him from creditors, covered youthful indiscretions, endured their mother's dependence, and built a gentler world around Oliver so successfully that Oliver had mistaken his brothers. Constant sacrifice for natural strength instead of cost. "I thought you disapproved of me," Oliver said at last. Adrien gave one brief, humorless laugh. "I have spent 10 years making sure you never had to know what I was protecting you from." Oliver's eyes filled. "And I have spent 10 years letting you." That was not yet the moment of surrender. It was the moment the battle truly began, because once Oliver knew, he could not unknow. And once Adrien had spoken, he could no longer pretend his silence had been kindness untouched by cowardice. For weeks after that conversation, Oliver said nothing aloud. He watched. He tested what he had learned against the life continuing around him. He saw Catherine grow still whenever Adrien's name was spoken unexpectedly. He saw Adrien go rigid whenever Oliver touched her hand in company. He saw, with new and devastating clarity, that the engagement he had thought honorable was in fact forcing the two people he loved most into a long ritual of self-betrayal. Yet Oliver did not release Catherine at once. That, too, required its own moral struggle, because to release her privately would raise questions. Because if he stepped aside quietly, Dorothea would pressure Adrien harder than ever into another marriage, and perhaps still attempt to keep Catherine at a distance under some pretext of decency. Because if he simply asked Catherine whether she loved his brother, he would be asking a good woman to confess a truth that could destroy her standing, while still leaving him uncertain whether Adrien would accept her publicly. Because some brutal, wounded part of him still wanted to be chosen. He hated that part. He honored it enough to admit it existed. Then, he mastered it. The decisive turn came 3 nights before the wedding. Oliver went to Catherine, intending, at last, to ask her for honesty. He found her in the morning room, folding linen for a parish box her aunt was preparing, performing the small, useful movements of a woman holding herself together by habit alone. He asked whether she was afraid. She answered, after too long a pause, only of being ungenerous to a good man. Not of marrying him, not of life ahead, not of love, only of failing kindness. That answer broke the last illusion he had left. Later that night, he found Adrien in the stables and asked a final question. "If I stepped aside," Oliver said, "would you still stand aside in my place?" Adrien did not answer immediately. Then, with terrible honesty, he said, "Yes, and I should hate myself for the relief." Oliver closed his eyes. There it was. His brother would go on sacrificing them all forever if no one physically stopped him. So the younger brother made, at last, his own adult choice. He decided that love could not go on being defined only by what Adrien was willing to endure. He decided that gratitude was not a sound foundation for marriage. He decided that if scandal must come, let it come in the church once, under God's eye, where no one could afterward pretend there had been merely some private weakness or shabby intrigue. Let the truth arrive publicly enough that Adrien could not retreat from it without exposing his own heart before witnesses. Let Catherine be given not a furtive compromise, but a legitimate place at the side of the man she loved. That was the fierce private logic behind the wedding morning. On the day itself, Catherine dressed in a silence so complete it felt ceremonial. Her maid wept. Her aunt called her pale. Dorothea Ashfield, who wanted the match finished with all haste and propriety, mistook composure for peace. Catherine herself felt almost nothing. That was the most frightening part. Not distress, not panic. Only the dead calm of a woman walking toward a future she had already begun mourning. By the time she reached the church, the decision in her had become almost abstract. She would do what women did. She would speak the vows. She would enter a safe life and call it blessing. She would bury the rest where no one could point at the grave. Then she reached the altar and saw Adrien. Not Oliver. Adrien. Everything after that moved both too quickly and with dreamlike slowness. There was a murmur through the church, a whispering rustle of silk and shock. Catherine turned instinctively and found Oliver standing a little back to the left, not as a groom cast aside, but as a man white with strain and yet absolutely certain of what he was doing. His certainty had cost him dearly. That was visible in every line of his face. He looked first at Catherine, as if asking her pardon for having taken so long to become brave in the right direction. Then he looked at his brother. "For once in your life, Adrien," he said, in a voice pitched just low enough to keep the moment from becoming spectacle and just high enough that the front pews heard every word. "Do not choose duty over happiness, when happiness is standing here in a wedding gown." Someone gasped. Dorothea Ashfield nearly collapsed into her salts. The vicar looked as though scandal and revelation had struck him simultaneously. Adrien did not move. Catherine realized with a jolt that he had not known. Oliver had done this without warning him, which meant the anguish now on Adrien's face was real. The hope was real too. "No," Adrien said hoarsely. "Oliver." "Yes," Oliver said, and now the tenderness in him had acquired steel. "You were prepared to watch her become my wife out of loyalty, and she was prepared to let herself be miserable out of gratitude. I will not have either sacrifice handed to me like some noble inheritance." He turned to Catherine then, and the generosity in his face nearly undid her because it was not easy generosity. It was wounded, conscious, chosen. "I asked for contentment," he said gently. "You were willing to give it. That alone would have made you better to me than I deserved. But I am not such a selfish man as to take a life offered in goodness when I know perfectly well where your heart has always been." Then he looked back to Adrien, and the full history between them entered his voice. "All my life," Oliver said, "you have loved by protecting. You protected me from our father's debts. You protected me from disgrace. You protected our mother from fear. You were even prepared to protect me from the truth of your own happiness." His voice thickened but did not break. "I will not let you do it this time, not because I am generous, but because I am at last trying to be just." Catherine could not speak. Oliver drew one breath, steadying himself inside the wound of his own decision. "I loved her," he said plainly. "Perhaps part of me always will, but she was never truly mine. And I would rather lose the wife I imagined than spend the rest of my life knowing I built my happiness on the quiet burial of both yours." The church had gone so still the air felt consecrated. "Marry the right brother," he said. Silence followed. Adrien looked at Catherine as though he were afraid, even now, that one hard breath might collapse the miracle. "Tell me this is real," he said, so low only she, Oliver, and the vicar could have heard it. "Tell me I am not about to destroy all of us for a dream I wanted too long." Catherine had spent a year swallowing truth for the sake of decorum. She was done. "It is real," she whispered, "and if you leave me standing here now, Your Grace, I shall never forgive you." Something like stunned laughter broke through Oliver's face. Something far more dangerous broke through Adrien's. He crossed the last step between them. The wedding that followed was not the wedding planned in invitations and family conversations and settled expectations. It was smaller somehow, though every seat remained filled. Stranger, holier, as if truth itself had stepped into the church and demanded room. When Adrien took Catherine's hand, his fingers trembled once before tightening. That single tremor told her more than any speech could have. The Duke, who could master estates, tenants, parliament, and his own reputation, had reached the edge of everything, and found that love made a coward of rank, and then, at last, demanded courage from him anyway. The vows were spoken. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, Adrien looked at Catherine with a hunger so carefully disciplined for so long that the tenderness of its release nearly shattered her. His kiss was clean, public, and devastating. Not because it was improper, because it was not. Because every person in the church could see that this was not lust snatching victory from scandal, but two people who had been starving in plain sight at last permitted to touch the thing they loved without shame. And beside them stood Oliver, grieving, upright, and strangely lighter for having chosen, at last, a truth that hurt cleanly over a falsehood that would have poisoned them all. A year later, Catherine stood in the orangery at Ravenfield House with one hand curved over the gentle swell of her stomach and late spring sunlight pouring over the tiles. The orange trees were in bloom. Beyond the glass, the lawns ran bright and green toward the lake. Somewhere in the distance, Oliver's laugh carried from the terrace where he was tormenting Adrien over some matter involving nursery furniture and ducal dignity. Catherine smiled before either man came into view. Then Adrien stepped through the open doors, and the whole room altered, as rooms still did when he entered them. Marriage had not softened him into anyone less grave or less formidable. If anything, happiness had made him more visibly dangerous, because now there was warmth moving under the control, and anyone with eyes could see what he loved. His gaze went at once to her face, then down to her hand resting on their child, and Catherine watched the same expression pass through him that passed through him every time lately. Awe, sharpened by gratitude, and the faint, lingering disbelief of a man who still occasionally woke expecting loss. "You should be sitting," he said, crossing to her. "You say that every hour." "And each hour I remain correct." His hand settled over hers. Even now, even after a year of marriage, that touch could send a quiet, answering shiver through her. Oliver's voice sounded from the terrace. "If you make her lie down before luncheon, Adrien, I shall tell the entire county the Duke of Ravenfield has been defeated by one very small, unborn person." Adrien did not bother turning around. "I was defeated by her long before that," he said. Catherine laughed, and Oliver groaned theatrically at having his point proved too easily. When they were alone again, Adrien bent and pressed his forehead briefly to Catherine's temple. "I used to think duty meant renouncing whatever I most wanted," he said quietly. "And now? Now I think duty may also mean having the courage to keep what is true once God places it in your hands." Catherine turned in his arms as much as her condition allowed and looked up at him. The man who had once stood at a distance in an old mill and confessed desire like a wound. The man who had tried to sacrifice himself for everyone and had at last been saved from his own nobility. "You were very foolish for a duke," she told him. Adrien's mouth curved. "I am told I still am." She kissed him lightly, smiling against his lips. Outside, Oliver's laughter rose again across the terrace. Inside, sunlight warmed the orange leaves, their child turned once beneath Catherine's heart, and the life before her glowed with the fierce, ordinary beauty of something chosen honestly. She had once walked toward an altar prepared to bind herself to safety. Instead, she had been given love. Not easy love, not tidy love, but the real thing. And in the end, that had been worth every ruined plan, every dangerous silence, every impossible, breathtaking moment it took to reach it.